Welcome to another episode of Artist Spotlight, the podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Stringer, and happy to be joined by Adam Lerner on this episode. I want to remind everybody that, as is always the case, the episodes are brought to you by the Maryland Photography Alliance. You can check out everything they have by going online at mdphotoalliance.org, where there's always information on skills and various contests and photo walks and just a lot of good information that can help you enjoy this hobby or this profession at an even deeper level. So I welcome you to check that out. And without further ado, I want to welcome my guest, New York City-based photographer, Adam Lerner. Adam, welcome.
Hey, welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure,
Great to be here.
So I became aware of your work, seeing a lot of what I guess you could describe as either personal work or personal projects, but it involves vintage cars.
I think that my passion for anything with two wheels and a motor started at an incredibly young age. And over time with photography, it just was a natural progression for me to just photograph like that aspect of culture and, friends, whatnot. Like I was really into motorcycles and, well, I should even back it up. I was really into vintage motor scooters. And then that led me to get into like vintage motorcycles. And then I went on a bunch of motorcycle tours with friends and I photographed a lot of that kind of stuff. But I realized when you're on a motorcycle tour, you can't really take a lot of pictures because you got to have both hands on the handlebars.
True.
And then when you pull over to get gas and then everyone's chomping at the bit to get back on the bike, there's not a lot of opportunity. And I've talked to other photographers about this exact kind of thing, that like riding is riding and photography is another thing. But with the car culture, there's a lot of like tire kicking. There's a lot of like, meetups and then driving and whatnot. And I just started bringing my camera like everywhere I went. And that kind of just led to me taking a lot of that kind of photography, which actually led to a lot of client work. So I think that the thing that I learned about that, and I think a lot of other photographers know, is that, if you photograph your passion, it's going to show, and that people will respond to that, and potentially hire you.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. One of the things that I think is so interesting, I was talking to someone earlier today. If you're a photographer, you're a photographer. Some people say I'm a street photographer, a wildlife photographer, whatever your specialty is. But as a photographer, you know how to use a camera. You're going to photograph different things. That said, there is a huge difference between fundamentally being able to snap a picture of a car and actually knowing car photography, and what sort of the nuances and the elements that make it different. And I had a guest on the podcast named Adam Moore, and Adam is a professional watch photographer. Now,
Oh,
we can all
nice.
take a pic, we can all photograph a watch, but brands go to him for his vision on how he thinks it's best to showcase their watch. And, Bob Chapman, who photographs motorsports, he was a guest, and we talked about photographing not only motorsports, but also cars at these cars and coffee kind of meetups, etc.
Hmm.
So I give you that context to say, when you are approaching a car, what are the things that your eye, as someone who shoots cars either on a regular basis, or certainly that's something that you really enjoy, what are you looking at when you come up upon like a vintage MG, or you name the car? What are you looking at that kind of catches your eye to photograph?
I mean, that's a great question. And honestly, it's like a lot of it is like knee-jerk reaction, like what kind of like the thing about vintage cars, like from that era, is that they're very friendly, they're very approachable. If you look at the grill on a car like that, it's got round headlights and like a a grill, and it looks like almost like it's smiling at you. And there's a certain kind of like approachability about some cars that just kind of makes you kind of want to get close to it and like maybe focus in on the details, especially a car of that size. And I think that scale is such an important thing, whether you or not you're standing adjacent to a vehicle or far from a vehicle, just trying to kind of understand the magnitude. Because we don't, in this current time, we don't have cars that are even remotely as small as an MG. I mean, that car is probably like, if you parked that next to like just your average like SUV, it would look like maybe an like a sixth of the size. It would look ridiculous. So there's something so nostalgic and beautiful about those. And for me, it's like I focused on things like, a lot of the craftsmanship, like if you look at, like maybe like the car's jewelry, if you want to call it, like all of the little chrome work, the door handles, the hinges, all of the little details in the cockpit, like the steering wheel and all the gauges, because all of those things were just so minimalist, but so beautiful. Grill details, just there's just a lot of like little things that, kind of create the sum of the parts. Whereas cars today, are so much more, for lack of a better way of saying, they're just kind of generic. Like all the seams are kind of flush, the lights are flush, everything's kind of smooth and rounded out. And honestly, like if you look at like maybe 30 different SUVs from different manufacturers and you just kind of put them in a lineup, like in the same color, and you looked away, you probably wouldn't be able to tell one from the next. They all have like that same, my wife calls it like sneaker cars. They all look like a high top sneaker.
That's great.
So so with classics, it's like and I know I'm not really like getting to the heart of your question. I think that for me, it's like I look at what the light's doing. I look at how it's grabbing the paint and the curves. I look at just how it appeals to me aesthetically and what I want to just say and share when I'm looking at that particular thing. Like to give you like a quick example, I remember years ago, I went to the Lime Rock Historics weekend, which is a weekend at Lime Rock where
Mhm.
they take, where people basically park hundreds, maybe, I don't even know, like crazy numbers of classic cars in on the track. And then the organizers try to put them by like type or era or, whatever. And I remember I brought my camera, but I forgot to put the battery in it. Like, it's a mistake that people make. It's like, 10 years ago, whatever.
You're human.
I'm a human. Yes, I was totally human. So I decided, I'm just going to photograph the same exact angle of every car. And I created a mosaic, and they were all different colors. And, as a mosaic, as a piece it became cohesive that way because I was able to kind of capture a certain look and a certain view from each car and then put them in like a mosaic pattern. And so I think that like, for something like that, it was like I was self-assigning myself. I was like, okay, I screwed up, so now I have to force myself to work harder to make something worthwhile to go home with.
Makes sense. Yeah.
But to get back to your question, when I approach a car, it's like if I'm doing it for fun, it's really just like aesthetically, how does it appeal to me? Its stance, different details. If I'm doing it professionally, then I have a whole different subset of kind of things that I need to achieve. So
No, that
that's
makes that
my
makes sense.
that's my long answer.
Well, as is the case with most areas of insight, like car meetups, etc. It's a unique group of people that are really into the cars, and you can see the intensity as people are walking around and they're swapping stories, and they're looking to see, the person who refurbished the car, did they use original parts, did they use, whatever it is. And I did go to a car rally once,
Hmm.
and what makes the car rally so unique, I think, really combines two things that you and I both happen to enjoy, which is cars. But this car rally took place just outside of Havana, Cuba.
Mm.
And so you had the added element of Cuban citizens who have access to really very little in the way of automobiles, unless it's, from many, many years ago with mishmash parts from every other vehicle to make them run. But not only were there cars at the meetup, but there were also vintage motorcycles at the
Hmm.
meetup. And just seeing the combination of cars and the vintage of those cars, and then the people and the outfits that the people were wearing. Some were just wearing whatever they chose to wear that day. Others were dressing up to kind of tie into the era of the car that they were driving. And, I found that the people were every bit as interesting as the cars.
There is an element of that. I actually was in Cuba 12 years ago, and I definitely like found the car culture to be pretty fascinating, like you said, because they don't have. It's not like they can just go to AutoZone. There ain't no O'Reillys for you, and
That's for
they're
sure.
they're incredibly resilient with like how they repurpose parts. I remember I saw like this, it was like, I don't know, a Buick or something like from the 40s going by, but it's sitting weird and and I was like, wait a second, it sounds diesel. And they're like, oh, those are hybrids. And they would take like diesel like trucks and they would literally take everything but the chassis and the engine and the
Yep.
drivetrain, and then they would put the shell of an old car because they couldn't get anything else for the old car on it, and they called those hybrids, which was pretty funny. But yeah, I think that what makes the car culture so interesting is that it's pretty much like non-denominational, and that people from all walks of life, all different socioeconomic backgrounds, are kind of welcomed into the community so long as they share the passion. And I think that's one of the things that really attracts me to car culture is that it's such an inclusive thing, and it's such a part of American culture as well. I mean, I grew up with it. My dad was a big car guy, motorcycles as well. So I just feel like it's like a kind of a universality. It's like a language. It's like music. It's like what it's like when like you hear a good song and like everyone's like bopping their head. It's like you see like a cool car and like everyone's like, oh, hey, look at that. It's like you can't help it. It's just kind of like ingrained into our psyche.
Well, and also how, you have kind of like regional car cultures. You have a
Hmm.
car culture in, Los Angeles that might be different from, a car culture, somewhere else. And so
Hmm.
it kind of, it's all cars, but it almost, it tells the story of the culture as much as it does the actual car.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I'm in New York, and the folks that I kind of run around with, we're of a certain kind of like, interest level. But then there's like subcultures that exist, that I'm not even like privy to. Guys that are like really into like, let's say like JDM, like the Japanese domestic market stuff, and they import these cars that were never actually brought into the United States, but they're 25 years since production so that they can bring them in now. And they're all right-hand drive for the most part. And like they're cool variants of Japanese cars that you've never seen in your life. And like there are people that are just obsessed with that. So there's all these different cultures that exist out there, that go so far beyond just classic car culture.
So, for those that are listening, who, at this point, when the podcast gets released, they'll kind of, no doubt check out some of your work, but, you're shooting commercial work, you're shooting portraiture. So how did you even get started with photography? Was this something that parents had cameras at home and you got curious and started using, mom or dad's camera? Or how to get started for you?
I think, like a lot of us, that's how it began. My dad was an amateur photographer, and he documented my sister's childhood, and he actually like he did absolutely beautiful photography. Like really, his understanding of light and composition was kind of incredible. And without realizing it, I guess that kind of like appealed to my sensibility. And then at some point, I think when I was living in Brook, well, actually, I'll rewind it a bit. In college, I actually decided that I wanted to study photography, and back then it was just we were just doing black and white film. I had my own darkroom, doing all my own processing and and printing, basically.
Hmm.
Um, and at the same time, I was also playing music, and I had the option after college to like get into either music or photography, and I chose music. But while I was touring around and playing all these gigs, I was still taking photos. So the passion for photography never quite left. And then when I kind of, retired, if you want to call it that, from like professional, music, that's when I decided to really kind of pick the camera back up as a professional thing. And it was like when I was in Brooklyn, I just kind of just started, shooting friends, and then a friend of like was like, oh, my friend's got a fashion line, you should go out and shoot with them. And it was kind of like very fortunately a natural progression, getting into it. But yeah, I mean, I guess I started off, mostly shooting, portraiture and people and lifestyle fashion.
So, with you having had, a career for a time at least as a professional musician, Is that was that a genre in photography that you had interest in, or not really? Photographing bands, whether it's album covers or live performances or promotional stills, or did you do that at one point, or did that not really strike your fancy?
It's interesting that you say that because for me, I wasn't really thinking about the professional photography aspect when I was doing it then. I was just kind of documenting my band, my friends' bands, like our life on
Sure.
the road, things of that nature. So it wasn't like I had like any kind of like intent professionally because I wasn't thinking of it as such. I was thinking of it more in the hobby sense. And then when I transitioned to doing photography professionally, I would reach out to bands managers and like big bands. Like I guess I just had no shame, and I would just say like, hey, I see you know LCD Sound System's going to be playing Terminal 5 in the city on the 22nd of March, and I'm a professional photographer. Here's my portfolio. I'd love to kind of shoot, have some access, and I'll share photos. And crazy enough, like they would just give me access. I would just go. There'd be like a pass at the venue. I would just take photos. Um, and I shot a lot of that kind of stuff. I shot a lot of my friends' bands. Um, and as much as I loved, that aspect of it, I didn't necessarily pursue music photography as a primary avenue. So I kind of did the music photography. Some of it was commercial, but a lot of it was just for fun, just because I love music. And here it is, like I've got like incredible access at
Oh
one of
yeah.
my favorite, to like an amazing artist, and I'm also taking pictures at the same time. So it was kind of like a win-win.
Yeah, I always think about, I played baseball in college. And so, from the standpoint of photography, when I'm shooting baseball, especially, that experience and knowledge, sort of inside the game stuff has always helped me have somewhat of
Mm,
an advantage because I can anticipate, what may happen. And I was that's why I was curious about, your experience, as a musician. And, frankly, I think probably what's more interesting maybe than performance photography is the behind the scenes stuff. You know,
absolutely.
it, yeah, it makes the musicians. I mean, they are human, but it certainly humanizes them even more so to viewers.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm like, I've been in talks with like a band recently who needs a bunch of photography. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's doing the videography for them. And I was saying, like, the only thing that really appeals to me is the stories. Like, I want to be backstage with them. I want to be, in the wings. I want all the stuff that nobody else sees. Obviously, doing portraits, that all sounds amazing. But as far as the documentary stuff, like that's the stuff that I love, the real kind of nitty gritty stuff, which I've done with a bunch of different bands. I was like, if they're just going to give me, a press pass, this, at the front of the stage for the first three songs, it's like I'm not that interested because there's going to be 30 other photographers getting, similar photography. I want the stuff that nobody else sees, and I feel like that's more interesting, not only for me as a photographer, but it's much more useful for that band as a photographer because those kinds of little interactions, those moments, those candid like scenes that they're not even aware that they're creating are so much more interesting that they could use for social media. They could use those for, album notes and all different kinds of things that give a much more genuine side to the band. Not to say that performance photos aren't important or interesting. I'm not like ruling that stuff out.
Yeah.
But I think that being able to tell the full story, and it's interesting because a friend of mine's son, he's a teenager and he's been shooting sports at school. And he was watching the Super Bowl and he's like, how do these photographers get to photograph, the Super Bowl? And I was like trying to say, it's like, look, you got to put yourself out there, start shooting your school, then, reach out to regional, sports associations and see if you can get passes and just build your portfolio and just keep pushing it and asking. And, you have to kind of work your way into it. It's kind of a natural progression. Um,
Yeah, there's really no shortcut. There's just not.
for most people, no. I mean, unless you're friends with, some pretty big, artists
Sure.
out there who trust to have you, up on stage with them and whatnot. But yeah, there are no shortcuts for most people that want that. Look, one of the things that I've realized early on about photography is that it's access. Everything is about access, always
Right.
access. And as a photographer, I've gotten access to stuff that I never in a million years would have imagined getting access to. And a lot of that's earned, and then some of it was just dumb luck. But if you can act professional and you've got the work to show it, and you can, and you ask the right people, there is access out there.
Oh yeah, no question. And it's, like any industry or life, it's about relationships. And
Mm,
so, if you do get that access, and you're there amongst six or eight or a dozen other photographers, be respectful, be careful what you say, who you say it to. You just never know who is going to be able to get you the next opportunity or put in a good word for you or a bad word for you. So yeah, it's not that different than a lot of industries. Probably the biggest challenge nowadays, and we hear so much about it, are what are often referred to as the rights grabs from different
hmm.
labels and artists. So you're shooting, and unlike Henry Diltz back in the day, you don't have your copyright, and you're really kind of on a work for hire thing. In the work that you do, is that relevant, or do you not really get into those situations where rights is an issue because the client is paying you to do the job, so they should own the images after the fact?
Well, look, it used to be that, in photography, photographers made a creative fee and they made a licensing fee.
Mhm.
And licensing was negotiated. In fact, licensing was often more important than your creative fee because your creative fee you made once. You showed up to the job, you did your work, you got paid.
Mhm.
The licensing was the thing that, for lack of a better way of saying it, could be the gift that keeps giving. Because you could potentially do a job, and the client could say, okay, we want this many images for 1 or 2 years, and then they have the option to renew, and then they could come back, in a year and a half later and said, hey, we want to extend this. Next thing you know, you've got another paycheck, and you haven't done anything. I mean, not that you haven't done anything, but you don't have to
Right.
do another shoot.
Yeah.
Or they would say, like, we want to buy out these images, and there would be a buyout. There would be like a tremendous paycheck.
Mhm.
Now, because of the short attention spans that everyone has and social media just being like a blip on the radar and everybody just wanting assets galore, it's a lot different with companies looking to pay or looking to get into licensing agreements for a lot of different things. A lot of the times, companies just they want everything. They want all the assets. They want to use them in perpetuity. They don't want restrictions. They don't want to have to come back to you. And unfortunately, a lot of it's non-negotiable. So I think as a photographer, you have to kind of decide, what you're comfortable with. And if everything, if a lot of the other things make sense and you're okay with that, then that's fine. I mean, to give an example, like if you had the opportunity to photograph like a young up and coming musician or baseball player or actor or somebody who you're like this person's on this trajectory, that's not the greatest imagery to give away because if that person like really becomes big and then they want to use those images from when they were kind of on the rise, you're going to have no leverage because they're just going to use them. And whereas if you had some leverage with your rights to those images, but now everybody's like clicking their iPhones. I mean, it's like it's very hard to have exclusivity on imagery, and I think that um, it's definitely something that a lot of photographers talk about as far as the rights and the usage aspect of photography, because I think that that's something that unfortunately is no longer a big component. And it's shocking how many clients you talk to, and they don't even know that this is like something. They're like, "What do you mean? No, we don't. What, a year? What is this thing? No, no, we want these. No, we're so." And I think that as a photographer, you also have to kind of do your homework and kind of know what these things mean when things are put into contracts. I think a lot of young photographers can be eager, and I'm not discriminating against anybody. Look, I appreciate anybody who's willing to hustle, but I think a lot of people that are just kind of cutting their teeth in this profession are maybe more willing to give it away because they're just happy to have the work. But what it does is that it undermines the folks that have been doing it for a while or it just lowers the price. And then for I think in a lot of for a lot of shoots, it can become a race to the bottom, price wise. So it's more challenging, than it ever has been, I think.
Well, and that kind of leads me to a thought around social media. Nowadays, arguably, there's more imagery that we're all being shown than ever before. It used to be you'd have a magazine that published weekly or monthly, and that's where you got all of these images. Now it's changing by the second, if not fraction of a second. So there's certainly more demand for images than ever before, but it seems like the pricing on those images is maybe never as low as it's been before, which seems like the opposite of what supply and demand would kind of logically tell you. So what do you think it is that has caused that? Now let me throw in one thought. Some have said, well, there's so many amateur photographers that have their phones now, and but I don't think that those amateurs who are at a concert or wherever taking those little snaps, they're not connected to wire services, and they're not selling it to these mass entities. So while that happens, while they do have, everybody has phones on their camera, I don't personally think that's what's driving down the per image usage pricing. But what do you think is causing this inverse relationship?
I mean, I think that this is like a huge hot topic, and it's been something that's been going on for a lot of years now. And I think that image creation has gotten easier because cameras are so unbelievably smart. I mean, you pick up the latest Nikon, Canon, or Sony, and literally the autofocus is incredible, and the ISO capabilities are incredible. Now, I'm not suggesting that like anybody can take a photograph, but I'm just saying like I think the bar for the barrier for entry is a lot lower than it's ever been before. And it used to be a photographer showed up with a camera. It was a black box. And then this stuff went in it, and then they took a bunch of pictures and they disappeared. And then like weeks or whatever later, there'd be a contact sheet, magic. And then they would pick photos, magic. Nobody knew. How did the photo, how did you create that? Put it in this black box and get this. Now it's like everything is absolutely instant gratification. I mean, I remember the days when tethering kind of began, and then all of a sudden you could like tether and also remotely share your photos, like, through a portal with an art director or, a creative person that wasn't in the room or wasn't even in the country. That was like a big deal. Now everything's instantaneous. Like there's nothing that stops the imagery, from being shared and put out there immediately. So I think that that people that are professionals that can go in and kind of knock out the kind of creative brief, and that a client is looking for, and exceed expectations, and have a really great attitude and get along with everybody and not have a gigantic ego and price things fairly. I think there's a lot of components that you can utilize to kind of ensure that you have a greater chance than the next person. But I feel like that, because it's easy to create work or emulate work that's out there, that oftentimes a client will just like pick the cheapest price because they know that like photographer A, B, and C are all capable. They all have, nice work in their website. All of their work is good enough for what we need it for. So what you have to do as a photographer, I think, is convince them that A, your work is different and appealing because of there's something about that, or there's something about you that makes the client say, I really like that person especially. I think that they're a really good fit for our team, maybe the best fit. They might be a little bit more expensive, but I know that that we're gonna have longevity with that, whatever. So I think it's just one of those things where I can't really put my finger on what it is, but I can say that clients now, because of social media and because the short cycle of imagery, like people just want like just a lot of images, and they don't want to have to differentiate when it comes to licensing.
So just to kind of feed off of what you said, so if I'm company X and I have a clothing brand, men and women clothing, casuals, and shirts and sweaters and pants, etc. And I'm considering hiring you to shoot my line.
Hmm.
What about Adam Lerner? What does Adam bring to the table for that general kind of a brand look? From your experience, what do you kind of bring to the table for that brand to consider when not looking at lowest price wins, but looking at fair price but best capabilities?
It's interesting. It's like I know photographers that might not be like the most technically proficient.
Mhm.
And I'm not throwing anybody in the bus, but they just have an incredible way of selling themselves and booking work, or they've kind of like tapped into a vein where there's a lot of nepotism and like word of mouth and like
Mhm.
they photograph for these people who talk to these people, or like they have a friend or a partner who's in a certain industry and just is like, oh, I honestly I think that hard work definitely can often beat talent, and I think that you just have to absolutely freaking hustle to try to get the job. I think that if you're not an asshole, for
Seems like a
lack
good
of a better,
requirement.
look, I think that a client wants to feel confident in your ability. They want to see that you're good at problem solving. They want to see that you're able to kind of like think outside the box. One of the things I learned early on in this profession is that, you might like go into a shoot. You might have done a pre-production scout. You might have looked at all the different scenarios, the entire building, blah, 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 whatever. And you might have like, sent them a treatment, like a deck basically with like all these different proposed, shots, you know, and despite that, you still have to have in your back pocket. Like if you propose A, B, and C, you need to have D, E, and F, or you have to have the ability to get out of your head and see a D, E, or F in a scenario when something is just not working, or that it's just not good enough. And I think that kind of creative thinking is good. And I think and I've heard these stories before. There are some, photographers that get out there, they get so hell bent on like one shot that they can't see past it, and they put all this time into lighting and moving stuff, just doesn't work, or it's just not working. And I think in that situation, you just have to say, you know what, it ain't working. Let's try something else. And oftentimes that something else ends up being better than the thing that you actually originally intended to do. So I think that if you're confident in your conviction and you're willing to at least adhere to what the client wants as far as their directive, but also bring some creativity to the equation, then that can form a good partnership. I mean, I can tell you that one of the things that I've also seen, and other photographers that I've spoken to have said the same, is I can't even tell you how many times I get solicited either by phone or by email, and clients don't really know what they want, or they just downplay it because they think, oh, it's no big deal. I just come in for a couple hours and we just, take a few photos around. Like you have no idea what goes into, like, that sounds great, but to get that to be so easy breezy, there's a lot of actual logistics and back end and production that is required. So, I don't want, it's like the whole mansplaining. Like, I don't like that aspect of it, but there are times when you literally need to just have a heart to heart with somebody and just say, look, I want to do everything that you want here, but to achieve this, it's a little bit more involved. And I think that we've had to become a little bit more flexible, knowing that the budgets to create these things has changed. So we have to manage expectations with a client as well.
Well, and what you just said makes a lot of sense to me. I know I've heard for years now, you had brands who would hire these, in air quotes, influencers who would put up these
Yeah.
pictures that were, with 17 filters on them, and but they didn't understand the science, if you will, behind the filter. They didn't know the effect that the filter was really even creating. So now they're on set and they don't know how to light a set. They don't know how to, literally, if there's not a set of filters to drop on after the fact, they do not know. And that's where, when you have experience and, the shoot calls for daylight and it's cloudy out, how do you, what lighting is going to not only be daylight ish, but the type of daylight you're looking. You don't want to wash out the garment, you don't want to wash out the model, you want a hint of light, you want to shape the light. And so that's where experience, is going to win out. But I definitely know, I've seen plenty of companies who they kind of know what they want the end result to be somewhat, but they have no idea how to get there, and they're not even 100% solid on the end result. And inevitably, if you go through and you do the entire shoot and they look at it and they say, that's not really what I was thinking, well, you didn't do anything wrong, you're just in the role of guessing what they want,
Mm.
not actually collaborating to, decide on what the finished product should look like. So how do how can you hit a moving target is what it becomes.
Well, there's two things I'll touch on. Number one, I think with the influencer thing that you're talking about, a lot of these folks that have these unbelievable Instagram feeds or whatever, it's so freaking curated. Every photo was taken at the exact right time of day, with the right perch and all that. So it's like you put them in a situation where nothing is easy and everything has to be figured out and they have to create this from nothing. Like then they're going to be flustered. I completely get that. So that's my feeling about what I was trying to talk about before is that, with all the experience that I've had, it's like I understand that if like a client says, "Oh yeah, we've got this room, it's 30 by 50, it's got this great light." You go in there, it's like the worst day, like there's absolutely no light, it's like black clouds and whatever, and like they only give you like 30% of the room. You just have to figure it out. And I think that's and still be able to create that like beautiful bright sunny day look that they were looking for. So I think that's like one of the things that can differentiate you from somebody else. But I think that at the same time too, what you were talking about is like when a client is so maybe rigid or whatever, they don't really know what they want. What I often try to do is I kind of try to walk them to where they want to be. So, I'm not going to push it on them, but like I have to have like a goal. Like I do pre-visualization for my shoots. So I kind of in my mind, like I will kind of see the final product to a degree. Doesn't mean that it's set on it, but I have to know that for me to get from here with what I'm working with to there, I have to kind of at least be able to see the steps, the path to get there,
Mm-hmm.
even if the client can't see it. And hopefully when we get there, that they're as happy with it as I am. And for the most part, that's been the case. Like it's not often, or it's really like not a thing where it's like, oh, that doesn't work. Don't bother. But I think that there is that element where you will have a client that'll say like, and they'll just say like goofy things like, oh, we'll just fix that in Photoshop. Or it's like, no, you have to be like, no, 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 no. We're going to go for the cleanest image that we have possible. We're not shooting for the edit. That's one thing I really don't care for. So let's mitigate the variables that are going to prevent us from getting what we want and get something that we all really like. And if it looks good right out of the camera without any kind of editing, then we know that it's like the example I use musically. A great song can sound great just with voice and acoustic guitar, no effects, no drums, no keyboards, no nothing. Just, if it's that strong, it doesn't need all of the other accoutrements to sound great because it's a great song. It's got a good melody, it's strong, whatever. And I feel like in photography, you have to have really good source material. Yes, if you want to do a composite, or you want to edit it, or you want to put filters on it, or you want to do all this kind of stuff, you still need really great source material. And I think that that's one of the things that maybe some people have lost. Like for me, it's like, even if I'm going to be putting a treatment on a photo, I still want the source material, the clean tone that comes out of the amp, the guitar and the amp, that image, whatever that is, I want that raw material to be really good, really strong.
Mm-hmm.
Because then I know that if I'm going to manipulate it, I've got something really good to work with. Whereas if you have something that's not working, heavily backlit or your focus, whatever, you can just play around with that all day. It's always going to fight you.
You can't turn shit into sugar.
Exactly.
You
You
just
can't put
can't.
auto tune on a photo that looks like shit.
No question. So, as far as style goes, and looking at, decent amount of your work, whether it's cars or it's cars and people or it's people or to me, it feels like it has a common look to it. And I say that from a very positive stylistic standpoint. Do you feel that your work has a particular look? Is that intentional?
You know, the reason why I stay with photography, which was very much the reason why I pursue music, is because it's a continuous pursuit. It's a study. It's an evolution. Um, it's like I read something early on that Clapton even said. It's like when people were calling him a master, he's like, no, 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 no. Even though he was like one of the best guitarists that ever lived at that point, he still hadn't gotten to the point where he could say that he was like a blues master because he hadn't, in his mind, achieved that level. And I'm not comparing myself to Eric Clapton in any way whatsoever. But what I am gleaning from this lesson is what keeps me motivated as a photographer is the constant pursuit of getting better, of doing better work, of even kind of pushing my style, my voice, whatever, even in honing it and refining it, further and further and further. I do feel like, I've got, a certain kind of a sensibility that kind of translates into my work, and I appreciate that aesthetic. I've worked hard to get to that aesthetic. It's influenced by a lot of different factors, um, but it's an evolution. So what you're seeing me create and produce now, maybe in 3 or 5 years, will be a little bit different. It'll probably still be along the same path, but it will continue to evolve. And for that reason alone is what, gets me up every day and excited to do it. I mean, I tell people that, like, yes, I'm a professional photographer, but it's also a hobby. I have a passion for it. I love everything about it. I love doing it.
Mhm.
So yeah, look, not every minute of professional photography is glamorous, but it's still a pursuit that I get like a lot of joy and pleasure from.
Well, one thing that I noticed is, looking at your website, you've got some of your personal work there, and it really seems to me like that personal work, not only is that an outlet for you to do and enjoy and kind of put focus on when you're choosing to do that, but I think that a lot of that personal work, because it is coming from the heart and it is things that you really like to do, I think that creates opportunities commercially because brands see that work and they say, I like that look. I like that vision, and I think this is sort of a two-part question, but, I have amateur photographers who go on vacation and they say, oh yeah, I shot, 250 pictures. Okay. And what would you suggest I do next time, or I'm going on a trip, and do you have any suggestions? And let's assume the place that they're going is interesting, so just they're going somewhere interesting. What I say to them is give yourself an assignment. Don't make yourself nuts,
Mm-hmm.
but give yourself an assignment so that you're making pictures with intention to tell a
Mm-hmm.
story of the people, the places, the things, and look at the pictures you take when that trip is done compared to your last trip. Do those pictures seem a little more cohesive? Like they're part of a bigger picture that tells a story. So that's what I would say with an amateur. As a professional, when you're doing these personal projects, it's kind of the same thing. You're focusing on you're creating an assignment. It's not an assignment someone else gave you. You gave it to you, and it may have a downstream commercial financial benefit. But maybe if you would share just your thoughts on assigning yourself projects, so that hopefully you hone your skills and maybe good things come from it.
Well, Mitch, all I can tell you is that you are touching on one of the things that I have been talking about for years, and I'm glad that you brought it up. And I think that every amateur photographer or any photographer, like self-assignments, forcing yourself to actually do something with intent is is such a good exercise. It doesn't mean that you have to be so rigid that you're stuck. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I think that when you the compulsion when you go to a new and interesting place and you're a photographer, whether professional or amateur, is to just go click, 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 and you're not actually seeing anything. And what I tell people, that ask for this kind of like insight is like, don't even pick up your camera for the first few hours or even the first day. Just walk around, take in the sights, take in the smells, talk to the people, and then think about, okay, everywhere I'm seeing people this and that, and that's really fascinating. You know what? I'm really going to focus on that. And if you do this thing that's your assignment, this little thing, and it can often just become a trigger. And this is what I find. It's like writers have triggers. Like little things that they do, and all of a sudden, pow, it shoots them
Yep.
off, and like that's where the story is. And I feel like the same thing can happen when you're traveling. Is like you can kind of fixate on something, but it often can serve as a trigger that will actually unlock something that you become truly passionate about sharing while you're there. It doesn't mean that you can't take a gazillion pictures and share the whole landscape, but if you walk away with something that has intent, then that's going to be an exciting little, what I call like a mini portfolio. And I try to convince people, and I even do it to myself. It's like I want to walk away from any kind of an excursion with a little portfolio. It's like a little gift to myself. It's like, here, I've done this thing. I've been disciplined enough that I've decided to shoot this with intent, whether it's like, I'm going to use this film stock, or I'm going to shoot these things or these people or these buildings or whatever. And or I might even have a few of these little self-assigned portfolios within the whole thing. And then at the end, I'm like, oh shit, that's like a cohesive thing right there. I feel like giving yourself assignments and self-assigning yourself these projects will give you such a greater sense of satisfaction, and it'll push you to work harder, because it's easy to just go click, 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 click. But then you're going to, like, how many times, I don't know if it happens so much anymore, but like friend of yours or somebody, like they go on vacation and then they've got like 250 photos, and it's literally like 250 photos of the same thing.
Sure.
They haven't edited it. They don't, there's like no real point of view. It's like, it's not crop. It's like, I feel like that's one of the things, like if you can convey that to somebody who's taking a trip, to really just like slow down, slow your brain down. Like, and part of the reason why you're doing this trip is for you, for your own personal growth, for your own self-fulfillment. And not every second and every item of that has to be documented with a photograph. There is the thing that some of those things that you see and smell and you taste and the conversation you have can influence other things that you do, even in other contexts. You don't have to sit there and like document every second and prove, look, I was here, I did that. Oh, there's another plate of food. Oh, it's like, I feel like for some people there's this kind of compulsion that stems out of an obligation, because like, oh, I spent, $3,000 on a camera, I have to use it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't discount that, because that is, something, but at the same time, it's like you have to kind of do it for you as well.
Well, when you were talking about just sort of slowing down and looking around you and not shooting at, every single thing every second, it kind of, in a way, is kind of my philosophy around street photography, where if I'm going to be in New York City, which I'll be in a couple of weeks, I'll look for the light, and I'll look for some backgrounds, and I'll kind of settle in, and I'll just observe. It could be, especially if it's morning and people are going to and from work, I'll look at sort of the flow of people waiting for the light to change, or in many cases, people not waiting for the light to change, but just kind of scoping it out. And then I start to feel like, okay, now I'm in it. And I just start to, compose. Before I pick the camera up to my eye, I'm composing in my head, and I know what lens I have, and I know generally what the field of view is for a given lens. And then once I start, I'm just making those images, and then I'll take the camera away from my eye, and I might look in a different direction from the same vantage point. I might move to a diagonal street corner because something about something is changing, and maybe there's steam coming out of a steam pipe where there wasn't before. And but
Hmm.
it even though I'm in the middle of a very busy city, I have the ability, because it's just me, I'm there by myself, I can slow things down as much as I want for me, and everybody else is busy and doing their thing, but I can really slow it down. And I think that, slowing it down like that, be it street photography or anything else, when you slow things down, you see more,
Oh yeah.
and it's like when they say about athletes, when a pro athlete goes from playing in college to playing in the pros, the game is so much faster. And then at some point, the game slows down. And
Mm.
generally, that's when they are most successful.
Hmm.
I guess, how do you handle those situations when you're, maybe out on the street or such, and you just want to sort of sit in that moment for a minute and observe and then make choices?
I mean, look, you touched on a lot of similar ideology that I have. I mean, another thing that I always impart to people, especially when they're starting out, is put one lens on your camera. Don't leave the house with a zoom. Don't leave a house with four lenses in your bag. You just pick the one lens. Okay, today I'm shooting 35. Today I'm shooting 50, whatever it is. And then learn to see the world at that focal length. And if you're too far away, then use your feet to zoom in. If you're too close, use your feet to zoom out. And I feel like once you can kind of like put the camera to your face and see 50 millimeters or 35 millimeters, then you can kind of pre-visualize your frame. So like you said, I love doing the same kind of thing. You park yourself in an interesting location. There's like people, there's architectural details, there's like light kind of refracting off of different buildings, creating different shapes, whatever. And then you just kind of wait for stuff to happen. And you know that you're at this focal length, so that you know that without even thinking about it, that as soon as somebody walks across that plane, that's your subject. Anything that goes across that plane, you know that you fire that, it's going to be an interesting shot. And I think that that's an amazing and excellent philosophy. And the other thing that you touched on that I tell everybody all the time is New York City is the absolute best backdrop in the world because you can literally stand in one position and you can turn yourself 180 or 360 degrees and up or down, and you have like 30 different photographic options from where your feet are planted. And
Yep.
that's one of the things that I think that people often forget is that you get you get that tunnel vision where you only see one thing. But if you can just like shift yourself to the right, look up a little bit. What happens when you crouch down? What happens if you shoot through that street sign? And you see all of these different things, and like you said, slowing it down, then you realize that there's so much more happening in every little sliver that you're at. So everything you said is 100% on point.
It's just, I've, like all of us, we've all made the mistakes where, we're just shooting, and
Mm,
had we been a little bit more intentional,
yes.
we would have had less pictures but more better pictures.
Hmm.
So about 6 years or so ago, I made a switch from Canon over to Sony for my sports and wildlife photography.
Hmm.
And I had picked up a Fuji camera that I enjoyed shooting a bit, and then ultimately that led me to a brand that you are very well aware of, and that is Leica. And so when I'm shooting, in New York, I'm shooting street photography, travel photography, unless it has sports or wildlife involved with it, where I need longer lenses, really fast autofocus, I'm taking, a Leica or Leica cameras into the field and so forth. And so, my question there is, you mentioned different types of film stocks, and
Mm.
generally, people choose film stocks because they like the look of a particular stock in a particular situation. And Leica certainly is known for and I'll do the air quotes, Leica look.
Hmm.
So, let me ask you, for those who are familiar with, let me get two different zooms and one camera, or two zooms and two cameras, and I'm good. Why do I want to carry all those prime lenses? And it's a lot. And, what are your thoughts on, why for you, Leica, and what is it about that look and those looks that speak to you in a way that maybe other brands over time just haven't?
Well, that's a lot. There's a lot to unpack, but we'll get ourselves there.
I'm going to take a nap now while you.
I'm not going to let you sleep. No, you're going to be fully participating in this. Um, it's like when I first was, like early in my career, I definitely utilized or fell back on like, a lot of zoom lenses, like the 7200, the 14 to 24, the 70, did I say 7200 or 24 to
Yep, yep,
70,
yep.
whatever, 16 to 35, just depended on
Yeah, kind of the standard
what
stuff.
the Trinity or whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
And within that, that's safe. I know that like if I've got this if I've got the entire range covered, I can probably shoot just about anything. And then what I came to realize is that I love 50 millimeters. Like literally, like you could take everything away from me right now and just give me a 50. Nifty 50, that's it. I'm good. I don't need anything else. That's where I started. That's what I love. I see the world in 50 millimeters. I've got a 35 as well for my Leica that gets very little love, even though it's a phenomenally good lens. I think that at the end of the day, the reason why I shoot with Leica there's a couple of different reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is the lenses, the glass. The lenses are just, there's something about the way that you can isolate your subject with incredible micro contrast, which sounds really twee. It's like talking about like microfoam in your espresso shot. Um, and the fall off both in focus and in light and the out of focus regions, the kind of the density of all of the information that's in that image, that even like lower megapixel Leicas still seem to have like big pixels, like all of this information. And I think that that extraction of information is really achieved because of the excellence that they put into the development of their lenses. And to the point where, like, if you gave me like a Z8 or something like that, I would just put a Tech Art adapter on it and shoot my Leica glass. I've done it. Why not? I mean, yeah, it's like maybe it doesn't have like the color science of like an SL camera, but I'm still going to get that glass. And I think that what I've come to realize in my practice as a photographer is it's all about the glass. And like to me, like that's like the top tier. That's the primary thing, the most important thing for me. Then the other factors that kind of play into it is like, okay, in a professional setting, like, is this camera going to stay connected when I'm tethering all day? What's the battery life like? What's the autofocus like? Well, in the Leica realm, those are not necessarily like the touch points that win like the accolades. But it's something that you have to kind of put up with. If I wanted a camera that's going to just literally have like the best autofocus on the planet, it would be a Sony, Nikon, or a Canon. And look, we can all talk about the merits of like one versus the other. I think that they all kind of like satisfy kind of like the same purpose,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to like moving objects or capturing any kind of thing, anything that has any kind of motion with it. But for me, I would rather have more signal and less noise. I don't want to have zooms. I don't want to have like all these different options on me. I literally just want to be able to go, and I know that with the right lens on my camera, I'm going to be able to get images that I know look a certain way that I absolutely love. And I'm not suggesting, look, believe me, there's photographers out there that like you look at their work and you're like, oh shit, like that was a Sony, A3 with a Tamron, whatever. It's like there's nothing like remarkable and special about it, but they've got like such an incredible eye. They've got a beautiful editing technique. And at the
Sure.
end of the day, it's like, I think, I think at the end of the day, one can be somewhat gear agnostic,
Mhm.
that, really kind of setting into a certain camp and like digging your heels and being like, I shoot Leica because it's the superior brand. I think it's a bunch of horseshit. I know a lot of people will just immediately poo-poo Leica because it's like it's so expensive compared to everything else. I know that like depending on like the kind of shooting that I was doing, if I really was like somebody who just needed like insanely good autofocus, I probably wouldn't be shooting a Leica.
Yeah.
So I know like so what I'm shooting with works for me, and I also happen to aesthetically like the feel of some of the cameras, um, and I also think that the color science that Leica uses with their sensors also helps to achieve a nice pairing with the really nice lenses that Leica offers as well. So I can't be like tremendously evangelical for Leica, only because it really kind of like, half of your audience is going to be like, I could never afford Leica. They're too expensive. It's a dentist camera. That's so snobby, blah, blah, blah. I really don't want ever to kind of like, you can literally get into a Leica on a sort of a budget if you really want to.
Mhm.
And, for me, it's like, I learned many years ago that like buying a brand new camera in the box with a warranty is just not how I operate. I don't need a pristine camera. I don't need something. I'm going to buy it and use it like a tool. It's like
Right.
I want this to be a workhorse. So what I'm alluding toward is that a lot of the gear that I buy is pre-owned because I know that I don't want to. I want the depreciation out of it. I want the nice thing that's expensive. I know that it is, but I also have to kind of figure out how I'm going to justify getting there financially. And I know that with some of the Leica gear, I look at a little pile of Leica gear, that's a much greater pile of Nikon gear or Canon gear. But it doesn't mean that it's like better. It's just different.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I had all of that stuff. I had, D3S, the Canon, the 5D, the 1DX Mark II was like literally one of my favorite all-time cameras I've ever owned in my entire life. Like
It's a
I could
tank. It was
literally
a
like
tank.
scream from a mountaintop and be like, this is the best camera that has ever existed. Now, whatever for a lot of different reasons. But I know I didn't really get to the heart of your question. I do find that the Leica stuff's incredible. I feel that the glass is just exceptional. And the pairings, I mean, that's why the Q is so successful
Hmm.
because you've got this gorgeous full frame sensor where you've got this gorgeous, Summilux lens and a free full frame camera with an amazing sensor attached to it. And like it's the gateway. Once you start shooting with a Q, it's like it's hard to not want to explore the realm of Leica a little bit further, I think.
Well, I had the Q. I had the Q2, and I have the Q343,
Mm.
which I am a huge fan of. So that's my go-to. If you said, you're not shooting an event, you're just out in pick the city, on a Saturday. For me, it would be
Mm.
the Q343. And I would probably I would shoot raw and JPEG, and the JPEG would be in monochrome
Hmm.
just to kind of see what that's going to look like, shoot to that, but know that I've got the full color file on the raw too. And yes, to your point about battery life, I'd have an extra battery with me. And but I just feel like, that 43, you mentioned the 50 that you like, but 43, close enough. 43 is a great focal length. And man, whether we call it weatherproof or weather resistant, certainly. I mean, that camera is hard to beat, I think.
And I can honestly say that like that's definitely on my list of like cameras that I'd love to own. It's something that I haven't sprung for yet because just the price has just been kind of
Sure.
like out of my reach. I have a Q2 and an SL2. They share the same sensor, the same DNA, the same battery,
Yep.
and they really work beautifully on a shoot. And like the lens that I use predominantly on my SL2 is the SL Summilux, the 50 1.4.
Okay.
So if I'm on a shoot with that and I've got my Q2, it's like I've got the wide, I've got that. I have a few
Yeah.
other lenses as well, but I could easily see like going on a trip with the Q343 and not needing any other digital cameras whatsoever. Because like I've mentioned before, it's like 28 millimeters. It's not like my go-to. It's not my favorite. So 43 is pretty awesome. And one of the things that you talked about before was like film stock, like and slowing down. I think for me, one of the things that I've also kind of brought back into my discipline is shooting film. And last summer, I started doing my own processing again. And then I purchased a professional film scanner from a friend of mine who upgraded his scanner to even a better one in his home lab. So they gave me the ability to really do a lot of stuff on my own, and as a discipline, it's been fantastic.
Hmm.
And I think that that has also kind of informed a lot of my digital work because the aesthetic from film, I think translates really, really well. Just as far as like how I see the world and, the fall off, the density, all of the kind of characteristics of film that I think a lot of it gets lost in digital. And one of the other things that I'm kind of jumping all around about, but I'm just going to get to while we're at it is, and this is not, again, I'm trying to be somewhat agnostic. I feel like a lot of camera manufacturers, particularly like Canon, Nikon, Sony, and even Sigma, they use coatings on their lenses to that over sharpen images. So you've got these incredibly high resolution sensors with coatings on the lenses that make things so sharp. It's kind of like when you eat a piece of cake that's like too sweet and it like makes you like feel queasy.
Yeah.
That's how I kind of feel when I see like over sharp images. And again, another one of the reasons why I love the Leica glass is because it's sharp without being clinical. So that was a really
Yeah.
long way to get back to that spot there. But and even adapting Leica glass onto other cameras, you still have like this all the little goodies and all the little nuggets. And I'm not even talking about like you don't have to buy the latest Leica glass. I mean, some of my lenses are 30 years old, 40 years old, and they're amazing. So, it's just I think for a lot of photographers, and I think now because mirrorless gives you the freedom. Like I look at like Fuji is like such an incredible platform because there's just like an unlimited amount of adapted lenses that you can put on them. I feel like the same thing is true with Nikon, with Sony, less so with Canon, unfortunately. There is some, but I think with mirrorless, it's like, why not, do a little experimenting?
Yeah. Well, and now there's also so many resources for pre-owned gear. I mean,
Yes.
there's a lot of resources, and because of that, those companies have to be more competitive because they want the business. So, to your point about just overall affordability of really any system is if you can get pre-owned gear where they know the shutter count, that you can look at the item. Generally lenses hold their value more than the bodies because the bodies get outdated somewhat over time. But and it doesn't just have to be Leica, any of the brands, as long as it fits the camera or there's an adapter that can help it fit, even if it goes from being an autofocus lens to a manual focus because the adapter is not going to allow the autofocus. You can get some deals on lenses that are in great shape, very clean glass, and it allows you to access some focal lengths that you may not have ever thought to do, or maybe it wasn't affordable to do. But there's just so many resources that are out there now that there weren't for up and coming photographers and really photographers of any age. And I think
Hmm.
also because of the shift largely from the DSLR to mirrorless, you have a lot of people who are dumping those lenses.
Yeah.
So, again, adapters will make them work, and you can really get some incredible deals.
I mean, when I had an R5, all of my glass was EFL glass. So it was all, DSLR glass, like the 51.2, EFL lens, the 85.1.2, like those were like my staple lenses.
Mhm.
And I just bought the RF to EF adapter, and they performed beautifully. And I remember I put an RF lens, I think it was a 50 or an 85, whatever equivalent. And again, it had like that coating that made things like so painful to look at for me that I found that I was like taking the clarity down, like I was finding ways to unsharpen. And I don't mean like I'm not talking about focus. Obviously focus is important. That's a whole different story. I'd rather have a grainy photo in focus than an out of focus photo that's got no grain, you
Mhm.
know. But whatever, that's a different story. But or unless we're trying to get like motion blurred, make that like kind of an intentional thing. So even when I had the R5, I was still using like older glass because I love the look of that glass. It's not as sharp. It's certainly soft, wide open, but there's like a more forgiving look about that. Like when you're photographing portraits and you've got people, people are not, nobody has like perfect skin. You don't really want to see like every little pore in like,
Right.
yeah,
It's
you
too
want a
much.
little, yeah, you want a little bit of something, a little bit more forgiving.
And along those lines, what would be your advice to, well, it could be amateur photographer or anyone who shoots whatever they shoot normally, and they say, I'm not, the quote is often some version of, I'm not really good at people photography. I'm not really good
Oh,
at portrait photography. So maybe if we scale it down to portrait photography, I'm not really good at taking pictures of people. I don't feel
hmm.
comfortable. I don't think they're comfortable. What would, do you have some words of advice to try to get them over that hump to give it a shot?
Sure. Um, I think that photographing people is difficult because you have to kind of absorb a lot of whatever that other person is feeling and going through.
Hmm?
And sometimes you're lucky and you get a really dynamic subject who's super comfortable in front of the camera and just gives you a lot, and you feel like a great synergy right off the gate, and it feels easy. There's some people that are so nervous and so in their head, and all that nervous energy is just being like directed right at you. It's hard not to absorb that. There are people that just I've had people that like the minute you put a camera up, they start crying because they're so self-conscious, and so you have to kind of like be a little bit of a psychologist as well to kind of understand how to kind of get somebody out of their head. And what I typically find generally is if I'm shooting a subject that I know that I'm going to be shooting, I try to do a little research. I try to figure, like learn a few things about them, because now with the internet, you can like look up people on whatever, LinkedIn. And so it's like, oh, you see a picture of somebody, on a fishing boat. You just bring up fishing or something of that sort. You know, you can talk to people about their pets. You can talk to them about their hobbies. As long as you can kind of like redirect, it's like the whole Caesar Milan with the dog. It's like you redirect their attention from the thing that's making them upset, and you get them to kind of like become more human, and you have this human connection with them, that it often is an icebreaker, and you might have more things in common with them, because if you exude uncertainty and your subject is feeling uncertain, then it really is not a good recipe for something productive. I think that if people are just terrified of shooting people, then just don't shoot people.
Sure.
Do landscapes, do birds, do sports, do cars, whatever. And that if and when you become more confident in what you're doing and you feel that you are compelled to talk to people and you can force yourself to do that, it's more rewarding than you may think. I think that there's some people that because they're not confident in their ability, that they're just not confident putting another person in that position. But at the same time, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So, get a friend, your nephew, your niece, your daughter, your son, your husband, wife, girlfriend, whatever it is, and see if you can kind of work your way into doing it. But it's not easy. Shooting people is like some people are just incredibly gifted at it. They just have like the gift of the gab, or they have an amazing accent.
Always helps.
Always helps. But look, I when I was first shoot, I remember I shot kind of a semi-famous person years and years ago, and she was like, she just took over, and I let it happen for a little bit because I was so intimidated. Finally, like I got my footing, and then I kind of like gained a little more ground, and then like set up some ground rules. And this is like just organically, and then but I think you just have to kind of like dig deep. It's
Yeah.
not easy. I wish I could say that it was like something you just get over it, but it's just not that easy.
If it was that easy, anybody could do it.
There is that. Yes.
There is that. Well, I know that people, Adam, who are listening, are going to want to check out more of your work. What's the best place that people can go to see what you're doing?
Well, there is something called Instagram.
Okay.
Um, that's where I tend to kind of just showcase like current and all kinds of goofy stuff. And I'd say that's probably the most current and active. Obviously, I
Okay.
have my website, which people are always welcome to check out.
Okay.
And yeah, I'd say those are probably the two best places if you want to find me.
That's great. And what I'll do is I'll make sure that we leave, the addresses for those on the podcast notes, so that everybody can find that easily. But I do want to thank you for your generosity of time and having a great conversation. It was absolutely a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely a pleasure. I really enjoyed this immensely, and I thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, no, it was great. And I also want to remind our listeners that we publish a episode on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you want to know what I have going on, you can go to Mitch Stringer Images on Instagram, same Mitch Stringer Images on the internet. And like Adam, probably Instagram is where you're going to get the latest and greatest, so to speak. It's just when I think of it, I put it up, and I put it up pretty frequently. A lot of times people want to send a DM or an email with questions about gear or travel ideas or, photo safari locations and all that. And I'm always happy to get those. We get a bunch of them and turn those around pretty quick. If you like the show, please feel free to subscribe and like and all those things. It helps get the word out about the program to hear people like Adam and many others. And so until we have our next episode, I want to wish you great light. I want to wish you great shooting, and we'll be back with you again soon.